I am a good deal troubled about what I am to study at college, confided 19-year-old Rick Olmsted to his journal in 1889 as he headed toward Harvard. I suppose I shall slip into Father's business and finally become a partner, but I have a feeling with me that I would like to be a teacher or a professor or a student of some kind. Of course, everyone here knows that Olmsted was foreordained to follow in his father's footsteps, and that he did so with grace, with dedication, and ultimately with great satisfaction. But it is certainly part of his history. Is that better? Can you hear me better? But it is certainly part of his history that the fields of teaching and architecture drew him well into his adulthood. Upon graduation in 1894, he was sent to George Washington Vanderbilt's rural retreat in Asheville, North Carolina, for a final polish on the education that his father had overseen so carefully at Harvard. Coursework that included mathematics, chemistry, botany, engineering, geology, and last but not least, fine arts. He took several classes under the tutelage of the social critic, aesthete, and devotee of Ruskin philosophy, Charles Eliot Norton. At Biltmore, Olmsted was to study and work as an unpaid apprentice under master plantsman and horticulturist Chauncey Beadle. It was an instructive year on many levels, for not only did he study horticulture and many of the practical applications of landscape architecture, he also took on ever-increasing responsibilities as Olmsted Sr.'s capacities diminished. Only once did Olmsted's unwavering obedience to his father's wishes falter, when in a 22-page letter, a rambling 22-page letter, the increasingly confused and anxious Olmsted pushed the young man far too hard about the importance of horticulture and botanical knowledge. The dutiful and loving son rebelled. After a long and elaborate explanation in response to his father's fulminations, he concluded, "If you say that more ready knowledge of plants is essential to my thorough success as a landscape architect, then I am compelled to answer with pain and regret, after the most serious and thorough thought, that I believe I would better enter upon another career." And that very day, he wrote a letter of enquiry to the architecture department at Harvard, where, he later told his father, upon graduation, he had already been offered a position as a teaching assistant in architecture. Well, in a flurry of letters among the family, the whole thing was sorted out quite promptly, and Olmsted fell readily back into line. By the time of his return to Brookline at the end of 1895, the 25-year-old Olmsted had been put on the payroll at the firm of Olmsted, and Eliot, now run by the two principals left, his half-brother, John Charles, and the gifted Charles Eliot, Olmsted Sr. having at last withdrawn from practice. Olmsted took his position in 1896, but within a year and a half, Charles Eliot was unexpectedly and shockingly dead at the age of 37. Olmsted, only a little under a decade younger than he, with little more than 2 years of practical experience under his belt, was perforce made a partner in the newly reorganized firm of Olmsted Brothers. His duties included picking up some of the threads of Eliot's extensive practice. Among them was the discussion of landscape education, for the field was growing apace, and the traditional methods of teaching, either being self-taught or serving an apprenticeship in one of the few existing firms, was becoming inadequate to the demand. In the mid-1890s, Nathaniel Shaler, an eminent geologist and paleontologist who headed Harvard's Lawrence Scientific School, decided to explore the possibility of adding landscape architecture to the school's undergraduate curriculum. He approached Harvard President Charles William Eliot, who was responsive, possibly in part due to his son's professional involvement. And so, in fact, it was the younger Eliot to whom Shaler turned in 1896. Charles Eliot was enthusiastic, although in a letter that year he urged that the new courses be included with the architecture program at the school, the Lawrence Scientific School, rather than with their engineering or science programs, or with the horticultural emphasis of Harvard's Bussey Institute in nearby Jamaica Plain. The popular notion that my profession is chiefly concerned with gardens and gardening is utterly mistaken, he wrote. Landscape architecture is an art of design, and in a very true sense covers agriculture, forestry, gardening, engineering, and even architecture itself. Since the word architecture is commonly used, he went on, does not convey this broad meaning, we have to put landscape before it to designate the broad architecture we practice. I think it would be best to give the proposed instruction in a school of design rather than in a school of horticulture, and that this instruction ought to be offered in close connection with the other arts in Cambridge, particularly in connection with architecture, of which great subject our art, as I look at it, is an important part. Even posthumously, Eliot's influence on the future of the landscape program reverberated, as it was his father who was the first person determined to establish the curriculum, in part because he thought it was a legitimate profession for the future, but also because he wished to honor the memory of his son and to help advance it as one. The mantle for arranging for the landscape architecture program at Harvard passed directly to Olmsted, now a whopping 27 years old. Herbert Langford Warren, the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture under the aegis of the Lawrence Scientific School, who was also a former professor of Olmsted's, continued communication about the program with him, culminating in a letter of March 1898 proposing concrete suggestions for courses in what he referred to as landscape gardening. Olmsted's response was quick and definitive, without the slightest hint that a mere 4 years before he had been a student of the man he was writing to. I have given a good deal of thought to this matter, he wrote, and I shall urge a number of changes in your schedule. Of course, I agree with you as to the importance of a grounding in the knowledge of architectural forms and in the principles of architectural design. Geology and topography were essential, as well as hydraulics and sanitary engineering. And he said, facility in mathematical analysis as a tool for clear thinking should be cultivated as an aid to many engineering and social problems of a complex sort. Add to that road construction, sewage disposal, and water supply. Also courses on botany and horticulture at the Harvard Botanic Gardens, as well as at the world-class Arnold Arboretum and the Bussey Institute, both also located in nearby Jamaica Plain. And then he came to the question of design. Here he affirmed Charles Eliot's emphases. It should not be forgotten the number of fine arts courses Olmsted took as an undergraduate, but even more fundamentally, the fact that from childhood on he had been steeped in the writings of John Ruskin and the arts and crafts aesthetes who were of such great influence not only on his father or of the men of the World's Columbian Exposition you've been hearing about, but on the educators who surrounded him at college, Charles Eliot Norton, Herbert Langford Warren, even Nathaniel Shaler, who wrote eloquently about aesthetics and feelings, as well as the science of the natural world. Most importantly, none of these men shied away from extolling the importance of beauty with a capital B, a precept that Olmsted internalized and advocated in varying forms throughout his life. He proposed to Warren that fine arts be included, the history of landscape design and the fundamental principles of design, with 2 other design courses designated for the 3rd and 4th years, one in the context of private places, city squares, and the surrounding buildings, and the other considering public parks, parkways, and suburban neighborhoods. At the close of his letter, he reiterated a concern expressed by Eliot. I have one more point to raise, he said. I shall urge you most strenuously that the name of the course be landscape architecture rather than landscape gardening. It was a point he was to insist upon, as his father had before him. Less than a year later, Warren wrote President Eliot to inform him that after 2 extensive interviews with young Mr. Olmsted and his brother, he was sorry to report that the result was negative. Olmsted, he observed, appeared willing and enthusiastic. It is clear he would have undertaken the work but for his brother's attitude. Mr. John Olmsted says his brother is already overworked and ought not to undertake anything more. If they should be less busy in a year or 2, I think something might be done then. They both expressed great interest in the plan. President Eliot was a man of patience and resolve. He readily agreed to wait, to which Olmsted responded with enthusiasm. I am glad the matter of the course in landscape architecture can wait another year. I want to see the subject introduced at Harvard, and I should enjoy teaching it if I could, without neglecting more important work. We could not do well what we are doing now if I should divide my time and energy, and for us to turn out poor work from this office would do more injury to the profession than my teaching could do good. Eliot's determination paid off. In 1899, New Yorker Nelson Robinson approached him about offering a gift to the university in honor of his son, Nelson Jr., who died while still an undergraduate. Because the youth had planned a career in architecture, Eliot suggested the father might endow courses in the newly established architecture department, to which Robinson readily agreed, including in his gift the fund for a new McKim-Mead and White building to house the department. Upon hearing that Eliot had also lost a son prematurely, Robinson further suggested that Eliot use part of the funds to establish a similar curriculum in landscape architecture. And so the first full 4-year program was inaugurated, situated in Robinson Hall under the umbrella of the architecture department. The landscape architects had desks at the far end of the large drawing room. Olmsted attacked setting up the program in his usual thorough and intense manner. Here was the opportunity to integrate at least 2 strands of his professional life: landscape, his birthright and chosen career, and teaching, a recurring interest. What's more, he was in a position to fashion the program from whole cloth, modeled on the teachings of his father and the educators who had made the largest impact upon his intellectual and aesthetic development. He had only one assistant in the process of setting it up, Arthur Aciel Shircliffe, then called Shirtleff, a contemporary of Olmsted's who was currently apprenticed at Olmsted Brothers. The 2 men created the curriculum and executed it together. The program was offered to undergraduates, postgraduates, and ungraduated men who wished to be landscape architects. Olmsted was the chief lecturer on the history and concepts of design. Shircliffe, who started as an assistant, lectured occasionally and taught the practical skills. Nathaniel Shaler gave a minimum of 4 lectures a year. October 19, the term began. The first course schedule announced that the purpose of the program was, quote, to provide instruction in the elements of technical knowledge and the training in the principles of design, which formed together the proper basis for the profession of landscape architecture. The 2 men divided their time, half in the Olmsted offices at their regular work, half administrating and teaching at Robinson Hall. Of the course they established, Shircliffe wrote, "At first this course was regarded as a snap course for AB students, but through our combined efforts, F.L. Olmsted and I made the course a hard one, but interesting both to the college men who took it as a side course and for the men who took all our courses professionally." Fortunately for us, Shircliffe made meticulous notes of the first lecture series taught by Olmsted and himself, complete with sketches. Here, 2 examples of ancient gardens. It is worth noting that the reading list for Olmsted students included Francis Bacon and William Temple from the 17th century, Joseph Addison, Alexander Pope, Thomas Whately from the 18th century, and Alice Amherst, Reginald Blomfield, and William Robinson as representatives spanning the 19th and 20th centuries, the latter someone he'd actually met while traveling with his father in England. All of these reading assignments reflected his environment, his training, and his personal predilections. By December, the course had moved along to practical matters: streets and road planning, bridges, forestry, parks, and park law. There's only one reason to show this indecipherable bit of paper, and that is because in the upper right-hand corner there is a notation that reads, "Mr. Olmsted in Washington," a reminder to us that by this date, in March 1901, Olmsted was involved in yet another large-scale project you've heard a fair amount about today, his service on the Macmillan Commission, the monumental effort to restore Pierre L'Enfant's vision for the mall at Washington, D.C. President Eliot was nothing if not a member of the Every Tub on Its Own Bottom Club. So it must have pleased him that 40 men were enrolled the first year and the same the following year. The 1900-1901 four-year program of courses in landscape architecture was presented, with detailed descriptions of the courses included and requirements of the four-year program spelled out. James Sturgis Pray, in a later description, writes, "In the first year, along with the work in design, to which of course the students devote more time than to any other aspect of his training, he carries a course in construction and a course in planting design, and devotes 9 hours per week to freehand drawing." In 1903, Nelson Robinson endowed the Charles Eliot Professorship in Landscape Architecture, first held, unsurprisingly, by Olmsted, a chair he maintained throughout his time at Harvard. Olmsted's obligations were rapidly increasing, and he was now dividing his time among the office, the landscape architecture program, and his work in Washington. With the dismantling of the Lawrence Scientific School in 1906, the landscape and architecture programs came under the auspices of the newly formed Graduate School of Applied Science, and landscape architecture inaugurated itself as a graduate-level program requiring a bachelor's degree or its equivalent and granting a master's in landscape architecture. That winter, with the program safely settled, Olmsted, overwhelmingly busy with his private practice, informed President Eliot that he wished to be relieved of all administrative responsibility and most of his teaching. And I quote, "After a long vacation this summer, I feel less tired than during the last 2 years, but I do not feel that I have the strength or even the immediate nervous energy to continue much longer the work I have been doing at Harvard, in addition to my independent professional work. I am now fully convinced of what I thought would be true when I took the work up, namely, that if a choice must be made, I can be more useful and happy in my independent work than in regular teaching of the profession." His administrative and teaching responsibilities were taken up by James Sturgis Pray, who wrote of this transition, "The department maintains the benefit of Professor Olmsted's rare professional experience through a continuance of his service in a consulting capacity in the advanced work in design. In this way, our students in their last year receive his criticism on their problems over the drafting board, and he is not infrequently with them in the field." In the spring of 1908, the landscape architecture program became a department separate from architecture. In addition to his other professional endeavors, from the turn of the century on, as we have heard so eloquently today, Olmsted was actively pursuing his interest in and promotion of city planning. In 1909, the subject was introduced into the curriculum of the Landscape Architecture Department. 20 years later, an official school of city planning was inaugurated. By that time, however, Olmsted had moved on. In 1915, with the school solidly established and his own career burgeoning, he resigned his post, confident he had achieved his goal, and moved on to designing, planning, writing, lecturing, and promoting his profession through the excellence of his work in the field and by his prolific speaking and writing. Landscape historian Melanie Simo writes that the founders of the Landscape Architecture Department at Harvard had, and I quote, "a particular point of view in that they were teaching landscape architecture as a fine art, as an art of design. It would be difficult to overstate the intertwining of Olmstedian teaching and practice during the first 30 years of landscape architecture at Harvard," end quote. Combined with the social conscience and practical considerations we've heard about today, as his long and productive career reveals, the underlying emphasis referred to by Simo was a consistent thread throughout his practice, and it serves as an important part of his legacy to the teaching of landscape architecture in America. Thank you.